everyone. So thanks for being here, coming to this webinar. So creating learning experiences in a swipe left, swipe right world. So we're going to be looking at some evolutionary psychology and looking at the future of learning in this webinar. But I know that I need to explain this for a few of you, what we mean by swipe left, swipe right. There's this app out there called Tinder. And what happens is if you sign up and you say your preferences, they start giving you pictures of other members. And what you do is you swipe left if you reject that person right on the spot, or you swipe right if you think that person's interesting. If that person also swipes right on your picture, then they put you together and you get to hook up. So the point is this, the world has changed significantly. What used to be a long courting process, well, actually before that, there wasn't even courting. Your parents would set this up after months and weeks of negotiations, and then they'd say, okay, this is your husband, this is your wife, now you can go make children. But then we went into the courtship process, and then now we're in this whole new world where we're making decisions in just a blink, just a flash of a picture. So not necessarily what does this mean for the world of dating and so on. What we're actually looking at is this is the environment where our learners are currently living. This is their mindset. This is what they're thinking about. So what does it mean when it comes to creating learning experiences for them? So I want to assure you that you are in the right place, watching the right webinar. This webinar is for you if you're the type of professional who wants to make sure this never happens again. All right. If you've ever seen this face on some of your learners, or if you can anticipate this face because of the type of programs that you have, then you know what I'm talking about. All right. So when you think about it this way, learning has changed, the world has changed, and we want to engage them and to bring them into learning experience. So a little bit about me. My name is Jonathan Peters, and when I talk about my path to the learning and development field is a little different. I am an old professor, still an adjunct professor. I have a course starting up on Monday, which is why we're doing this one this week, so that I can set up my summer courses. But as an adjunct professor, I'm not a full-time professor, but so I was into writing. Spent a significant amount of time looking at why we do what we do, why do we make the decisions we make, and how does language impact that. So been around the marketing world as a copywriter for some time. And but there came a time when I quit trying to become a professor, because to move from adjunct to regular professor is quite a process, takes a lot of politics. But what I did is I thought, well, this would be good. I should go out and give seminars to regular folks, to business professionals, because I don't know if you've noticed, but the older you get, the younger college students get. So I signed up with a company that does seminars throughout the country, throughout the United States. And I said, well, wouldn't this be cool? This would be kind of fun experience. And I can still remember my first seminar. Okay, so I'm used to being in the classroom. This is back in 2007. So back in 2007 was when I was going out to do this. And the first seminar that I gave was in Bakersfield, California, okay, for 72 people. I'd never been mic'd before, for 72 people, and the topic was business grammar. All right, so there are three things wrong with that statement. Three things wrong. Bakersfield, California. If you're from Bakersfield, California, sorry, I'm going to insult you for here just a little bit. If you've been to Bakersfield, California, you know what I'm saying when I say don't put this on your bucket list. All right, Bakersfield is just one of those places in the world that if you never got to it, you'd be just fine. so Bakersfield, California, 72 people, and like I said, I hadn't spoken in front of a group that large before, hadn't been mic'd in, didn't know what it was like to present with a microphone. Actually, when I arrived, they only had the room set up for 50 some. We had to slam in some tables, get to change the seating around, try and get a sound check while people were already in the room, and so on. It's very, very stressful. And then business grammar. All right. I don't know about you, but for a lot of people, business grammar is not that interesting. Not that interesting. So the point is this. About it started about 9:30 and 9:40. I look out over my audience and I see 72 versions of this. All right, so there's bored people, and I knew something needed to change because while I was a relatively popular professor, I was giving my students exactly what they expected, and that was dry, boring lectures. They expected it to not be fun, to not be exciting, and they also it also only lasts for an hour instead of all day. and I had my grades, their future was in my hands, and so of course they had to be nice to me. So when I started, that's what brought me on the journey to be with the company I'm now with, Sentential Gamification. But because what I wanted to do and started searching for ways that, first of all, we could entice people to learning programs. Okay, so how do we make it interesting for them so they want to learn? So, and then once they're in the program, how to engage them in learning, which is important, so that they're actually involved, and then encourage them to take it out of the learning experience and actually apply it to what they're doing. So to encourage them to apply learning to their professional lives. So as part of that, and more recently in my current role, doing a lot of research into what about the learning process, because obviously in my mind we were doing it incorrectly and there has to be something better out there. So for our program here, let me move the chat bar over here so I can see my own slides. I mean, look at the history of learning. The history of learning. Language has been around for about 10,000 years. Okay, so language was invented roughly 10,000 years ago. So learning obviously happened before that. You and I could stand shoulder to shoulder, and I could show you how to make an arrowhead. I could grunt when you did something right. I could opposable thumbs, and we'd raise our thumbs, or I could smile. You do something wrong, is slap you up in the backside of your head or something. But really, when it comes down to learning, cannot happen. Significant learning really only happens after we have language. So if we represent the 10,000 years as an American football field here, we so we start all the way down there on at the 100-yard line, at the 1 yard line, however you want to look at it. We don't language is invented, but we really don't get written language until about 3600 BCE. And so we're not even quite to the 50-yard line. And this is only the cuneiform type writing. So most of us are familiar with how the Egyptians kept track of things and told stories with their symbols. The Sumerians were the same way. We don't really get the first alphabet until about 1800 BC. And so this becomes important because that's when writing really begins to happen, is right here in this spot. And then, of course, what's very, very significant is the Gutenberg press is not until 1436. 1436, so almost to the 5-yard line. So, I forgot to, let me slow down for just a little bit. Each hash along here represents roughly 100 years, okay? So the was that right? 5, 6, 7, yeah, 100 years. So that's where we get the 10,000. So all of this time coming up to where the Gutenberg press is, we don't have the opportunity to most of us don't have the opportunity to actually read or access books. So the formal education that we have now could not have happened before the press. A few people in throughout time could sit at the feet of the master. So Socrates, what would that be? Socrates, right around in here. We could sit at his feet and hear directly from him. He could his I guess it'd be over here. His Plato, his disciple, his student, could write down the works, and a few people could read what Socrates said without actually sitting at his feet. But for the most part, it wasn't until after the press that we could actually have formal learning. And so what happened at the time is that the people that we turned to see what learning was all about, to teach us, because we didn't know how to read, very few people knew how to read, is we turned to this one class of people called the monks, right? Because they're the ones that not only read, they're the ones that copied book to book to book to book. Before the press, it was a very laborious process to translate or to keep the books moving forward. So these were very, very interesting folks. They were not normal. They were not typical for the time. They chose to sleep on the floor. They chose to get up like 4:30 in the morning and say prayers, and they chose to eat miserable food and not deny. They chose to deny themselves all pleasure. In fact, they would work all day long, very, very carefully, writing, copying books, and then they take breaks to actually whip themselves and so on. But because they were the literate at the time, we turned to them to say, how is it, how do you learn? How can you teach other people how to learn? How do you read books? How do you consume books, and so on? So I want to suggest that this new model of learning is not necessarily natural for most of us. It was something that the monks had to learn. Oh, and by the way, they even took vows of silence, right? They didn't even talk. A lot of them didn't even talk during the parts of their lives. And this is where we came up with our model of learning. The master would sit up here, the students would sit down here. Of course, the monks had chants and rituals, and that's what entered into our learning experiences. So the problem with that is, like I said, this is not normal. This is not typical. So when we look to, again, go back through the history here, all the way up to here, this little area right here represents this new learning model, which we've had for a significant amount of time. But then something else started to change in our experience. First of all, the Apple Macintosh, and some of you are like, well, he's just an Apple man, Apple freak. But we had personal computers for quite some time before the Mac came out. But this is the Macintosh is significant because it's what created the user interface that we're used to today, that we think of today. And then, of course, the World Wide Web became available to the public in 1991. So the period between there, learning had to happen the traditional way of reading books and so on. But now I'm suggesting with our current experience, this is a good time for us to rethink how we present learning experiences, the learning experiences that we create. So my school took after this model. So my undergrad, I was at a small liberal arts college, private college, university, I'm sorry. And so this is what learning looked like. All right. So I'm not that old, but this was taken some time before me. But it looks familiar to me. Those desks, we would have these old creaky wooden desks, and some guy would be up front yammering away with still with chalkboards. This is my era back here in chalkboards and then charts on the wall and so on. This is the model that I was raised in. Meanwhile, children these days oh wait, no, I forgot about this. All right. So in fact, this is an experience that we would have. This was the testing. We'd spend all semester and then we would have this. So if you would, we got a few more folks on the webinar. So if you enter in the chat bar, one, if this looks familiar to you, a two, or no, let's put a zero if you don't know what the heck this is. All right. So if you would, just in the chat bar, put a one for if this is familiar to you, a zero if you're unfamiliar with this. We could probably guess your age. All right, get some of those in. All right, all right, all right, gets a zero. Just depends what your college experience was like. All right, who else? One if it looks familiar, zero if it doesn't. What would happen here is that at the end of the semester, sometimes in the middle, we'd have midterms. We would have to collect these. We'd get a couple of these blue books, and in my case, for 2 hours, finals were 2 hours of non-stop writing. What was typical in my courses, because I was an English major with a poli-science minor, and typically what you do is you'd have 2 or 3 questions and you would have to write non-stop for 2 hours, answering, say, 2 out of the 3 questions. Very, very interesting. And then if you were oops, here we go, click, there we go. If you were lucky and you had one of those fill in the dot type tests that were just coming into vogue, certainly in other colleges, state colleges, you would get these, the fill in the dots. Now here's the point here. Really, before the Gutenberg press, this is the only type of testing that we could do. Is the blue book would be me writing down my thoughts, responding to questions. After the Gutenberg press, we can do fill in the dot type testing. And the problem with this is, again, this isn't how the brain does things. I don't really, just filling in the dot, first of all, you can guess. You might have 4 possible answers, or if it's true or false, you might not. So to give you a little story, a little example, I remember my one course I had called music appreciation. It was about the history of music, but I think it was called music appreciation, and it was the professor's last semester. Now, the college I went to, it was up in Michigan. And so, if you can imagine, the winters are relatively cold up in Michigan. He wore a Hawaiian shirt every day because he was about to retire. And so he's very excited about this. And like I said, we only had a midterm and a final. And here was the thing. And I think we had weeklies, but I still remember the final. What he did is, before he would give us a test, the day before, he would read us the test and tell us what the answer is. So if it were to fill in the dot, he would read us the question and then say, well, so obviously that is C, and then would read us the right answer. So all we had to do is, before the major tests, is take really, really good notes and memorize those notes. So to this day, I still remember the true and false part of it. Okay, you ready? It went like this: false, true, false, true, false, true, 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 false, false, true, false. All right, so that's what I remember from music appreciation class. I remember there's some loud song one time that was about Hiroshima, and because I was sleeping, and it has this big crashing thing when the bomb goes off. I don't know anything about it except that it woke me up, right? Not practical, not how we naturally learn. So this is my experience going to college. This is the new experience when it comes to learning. This is how your younger learners are interacting in the classroom. They have screens in front of them. It's open classrooms. There's a lot of movement. There's a lot of creativity. So this is what they expect. We now have the opportunity to change our model, to change how we think things, how we create experiences for our folks. So to come back to this, I'm going to look at 3 categories here that, when we look at this full 10,000 years here, I'm going to look at 3 broad categories that we can expand on. Okay, so that when we later on that we'll expand. But these 3 categories, I want to first of all suggest these are naturally how we learn, and that you can apply them to your learning programs. So part of the reason that we're doing this webinar is as an introduction to a series that I'm giving for ATD Austin. So the Association of Talent Development at Austin, I thought, well, why not do some summer school for July and let's create this webinar series. And you'll notice there on the right this is the webinar number 1 of 4. And so it is an introduction. And then what I'll be doing is expanding on each of these 3 categories throughout the rest of the month. So every Thursday, I'll be holding a webinar such as this. So not to give it away, but the things we'll cover next week on the 12th, I will look at play, gamification. After that, in the 19th, story. And then if you skip down, because we have a chapter meeting in between there, skip down to the 26th, then we'll be looking at persuasive phrasing. But the point is, like I said, this one is free to open it up. After this, there's a charge for non-members, so it's $40 each one. Now, here's the thing, folks. it's also free to members. So if you just follow me, like I said, I was an English major, so I'm not the best at math, but so there's three of them at $40 each. That's $120. It's free to members. Membership is only $75. So perhaps if you wanted to go through all of these programs, all of these webinars, perhaps it makes sense to not to sign up for membership, because not only is it slightly cheaper, but then you can engage with the chapter throughout the year. Presented recently for the state workers, so for people in talent and development in the working for the state, and a special little arrangement that I put together for you. And so if that's your case, if the great state of Texas is your employer, if you would just go ahead and email me at bighead@sententiagames.com, and I'll give you a little insight into that. So this is my email here. Feel free to email me about that or anything else we're looking at here. Okay, so the point is, like I said, I'm giving the three away already here, but let's look at them in a sequence. So the first one is play. Play. Over that 10,000 years, what we have, and even before then, before language, we consistently learn through play. It's how children learn. When we so here representing how did we learn our roles. We didn't need language for this, but young boys would play at weapons, play at hunting. They would play, like I said, war games, different types of sports to prepare them to go on the hunt or to go into battle. The girls traditionally would play house, would have dolls, would play house so that they could learn their roles. This is how we traditionally learned. And more recently, some amazing studies have been done when it comes to this natural concept of how we do this. Children, when it comes to learning, naturally play as well. For instance, we sing our ABCs. We make it fun. We don't grind through it. We don't have weird tests for it. We sing it. We have flashcards. Excuse me. We just naturally do this through play, and this becomes very, very significant because for some reason, those monks were very against play. They were against laughter. They were against joy. They wanted to live very bland, miserable lives. And so they cut that out of learning. Now our audiences expect to engage, expect to play. So I have this reference here. Johann, I have to look at it here, Huizinga. Interesting book. I'm not recommending that you read it. It's very academic and scholarly, but what he demonstrated is throughout history, he went to pre-language, pre-history, and he noted how play and culture go together. We don't have culture without play, and he gives lots of different examples of this all the way through. And when he was writing this, I believe it was the 1940s during the Industrial Revolution, he was lamenting that play was no longer in part of culture, and so he was worried about culture dying off. Of course, now we have play all around us. We have video games everywhere we look, on our phones that are constantly in our pockets or in our purses. We typically have games in them that we can pull out and play at any time. We can socialize, which type of play with, say, social media. So fortunately, humans have created play back into our culture from a time when we almost lost it. So this is how we learn. This is how we interact. Okay, so quickly, like I said, there's not a ton of you on today on the webinar, but so you can play along for those who are holding out for the recording. But if on this next slide here, if you would type in the games that you played as a child. Okay, so these are some of the games that were around when I was a child. I was at the front side of the video games when I was young. So if you would put in the chat bar, what games did you play as a child? Okay, good. We got the Game of Life comes in, and that was my sister's favorite. When you come for the gamification segment, which will be the next week, I'll give you a good example, a good story on the Game of Life. Has Scrabble. We have Clue. Clue had this great story, this great mystery that we were creating. Scrabble on the word side of things. I know that I still play word games today. I don't know that. Monopoly, one of the top selling games of all time. Over time, there's been times when other games have pushed past it. So let's use that one really quickly, and I want you to think about this. Not going to take. Let me look at the time. See how I'm doing. Yeah. Um, but to think about what is it that we learned from playing a game like Monopoly. So most people are familiar with it. What would be something that we learned? Well, first of all, there's houses and money. So we learn about how getting money, losing money, maybe chance gets in the way, how we might get hurt by different things. But we learned rules, and I was just up at a family reunion in Portland, Oregon, and so I guess he'd be a second cousin. I remember playing Monopoly with him, and he had a whole different set of rules. And he changed the rules, and he was older than me. I always suspected that he was changing it in his favor as we went through, right? And we learned about fairness and about turns and so on. So we learned quite a bit with the game like Monopoly. So it's important that we understand that games are impactful. Now, normally when we talk about, say, gamification, where this in learning, which is becoming more and more popular and more standard in our learning programs, what usually happens is folks would look at over there and they say, well, everybody likes to play games. These young people are playing games all the time. Games are fun. My training is boring. What is it inside of games that I can apply to my learning programs? And so most people are taking it from that level. What I want to suggest here is that play is how we naturally learn. That's how we learned as children. It's how sometimes we still learn as adults. It's only because of that system from the monks that we lost this segment from it. So again, I'm going to have next week we're going to go into gamification specifically. So just to differentiate a little bit, because I'm going to be speaking at the Serious Games conference over the next 2 weeks. There's one just oddly done. The conferences in two different places a week apart. So in Washington, D.C., I'll be at the Serious Games conference, and then also up in Buffalo the following week. But serious games are where we create games that have a purpose. So, and usually it's a learning purpose. But gamification is a little different. It's subtle in that it might not necessarily look like a game, feel like a game. So, to give you a quick definition here, working definition, gamification is motivational design. And one of the things that I always tell people is, or advise people that want to go through our gamification programs, is that if you ever have resistance to getting it funded, gamifying, making your learning fun because the people holding the money or the higher up folks are like, we're serious people doing serious work, or they say things like, we already pay them to come to work to go do their job. Why do we have to make it fun for them? If you just change the word from gamification to motivation design, that seems to go over a little easier. Okay, so let's continue the definition. Gamification deconstructs games to use the psychology and mechanics of games in a non-game context, such as learning. And to engage users and to solve problems. It's not necessarily about playing games. It might not even look like a game or feel like a game. It's just taking those game elements and applying them. Okay, so making learning fun is an important aspect of engagement because it's how we naturally learn. Okay, so getting back to this, so the first one is game, to play is how we learn. The second thing when we're looking at all of this is how was information moved from generation to generation before we had written language, and then only certain people could interpret the language before we had an alphabet. Only certain people could do it. Remember, it wasn't until the Gutenberg press that now the masses had access to stored information. The only way information moved through all these thousands and thousands and thousands of years was through story. So that's that's the second category that we'll look at. And so that this one's 2 weeks from now. I'll delve in deeply into this because, again, a lot of fascinating research has happened in the last couple of years looking at brain chemistry and fMRIs when we are hearing a story. And so things like uh, oxytocin being released. So the suggestion was in one study that we ought to tell stories to create teamwork, right? So there was some other fascinating things about all the chemistry, brain chemistries that are being released. But here, what I want to suggest is also story is the way that we retained memory. We retain memory, and also to apply ideas to different categories. So, for instance, well, this study is interesting. If you teach someone to do something, and maybe you've had this process before, if you teach someone how to do something, and then have you ever had the experience where then they go over and do a different task that's parallel, almost exactly the same, and they can't do it? They go, I don't know how to do this. And you say, well, it's just like that other one over there. And the reason for that is because our brains put memories in certain little boxes. But when we tell story, then we can translate that over many different boxes. So for instance, in this situation, here's the grandpa over here, and he's telling the younger generation, the youngest generation, about a story about his grandfather. So great-great-grandfather to this little guy was running down the path one day, and all of a sudden, right in front of him was a big, huge bear. And what he did, great-great-grandpa did, is he froze. He froze and then slowly began moving backward. Now, that's against our fight or flight mechanisms. Normally, we see danger, we would run away. But if we run away, guess what a bear does? A bear says, shoot, now I got to chase the little brat. And then, of course, fighting a bear, attacking a bear, you probably come out on the losing side. The proper way to confront a creature like a bear is to freeze and then slowly move away. So this little boy now is running down the path, a different path, and he comes tearing around the corner and he sees one of these, a saber-toothed tiger. And guess what he's able to do? This wasn't part of the story, this wasn't part of the instruction, but he freezes and then slowly begins to walk backward because that is what he learned in the story. And so a lot of research has shown that this helps us, makes us better able to apply our learning to different situations. So that's this. Now, let's move to the memory side of things, because remember, thousands and thousands of years, the only way we could move things was by memory. And so to do it this way, in this back, here we go, the Gutenberg Press, And when we look at the Gutenberg Press, the first book that was printed was the Bible. And there it is, was the Bible. So just to give you a quick little summary, the first book of the Bible is called Genesis. So it's Genesis, it is the beginning story, the creation, the beginning story. Then there's the great flood. Then there's this guy named Abraham comes along. He has two sons by two wives, or two women. I'm sorry, only one was his wife. One of those sons learns from that debacle. And so he has only one wife, but he has some twins. One of those twins goes on and has 12 children by four different women, and by the way, one daughter. Okay, and so one of the sons gets everybody and goes to Egypt, and so then they're in Egypt for a while, which brings us to the second book, which is the book of Exodus. These guys, it's now time to leave Egypt. Okay, so they start their journey, and after a few weeks or so, this man is their leader. This is Moses, not the actual picture of Moses. This is Moses played by Charlton Heston some time ago, so not the real Moses. But he goes up into this mountain, Mount Sinai, and he's given these two tablets with the commandments on them. So he comes back down the mountain. Now, while he was away, his people are having a big celebration, having this big party. Moses gets mad at him. He throws down these tablets. They break some, so he needs to go back up the mountain and get another pair. Now, what's important here is he's sitting right about here on this side of the 35-yard line. So just past the 35-yard line. And so while the alphabet has been created, this alphabet on the stones has not been created for yet another 250, almost 300 years from now. So not the actual 10 Commandments there, but you get the idea. Okay. All right, get another lost sound. Okay, I'm watching on my side. I'm not sure what's going on out there. All right. So we have the Ten Commandments, and then what happens is Moses takes them down and he puts it in this box. Puts it in this box here, this gold box, and he with this gold box, what they do now is he takes this tabernacle. So this is what he created or had his folks create. And so he put this fence around this thing, and this created the holies. So you and I could come in the front door here. We could do our sacrifices here. The priests got to go inside of this tent and do their work. And inside of this tent was another room, a small room called the Holy of Holies, or the Most Holy, I'm sorry. This is the Holy of Holies. And the Most Holy was a little room inside of here, and that's where Moses put the box. So once a year, one man would go into that room and be with the gold box all by itself. So now people would see, or at least see it. That box got to go out a couple times in a couple battles until one guy got killed by touching it. And then, of course, they would have to move this. And so in the movement, they would drape it, and so you would see it. And this partly is why it took them so long to get a relatively short distance, because if you start tearing all of this down on Sunday, and then it has to be all set up again on Friday because for no work on Saturday, and that's when sacrifices are going on, and then you have different festivals and so on. That's a lot of work moving this around. So when they finally got settled, Solomon famously built a massive temple, not the actual picture of it. We don't know what it actually looked like because we haven't seen it. But inside of here, he had, again, a special room that only one priest went once a year into the presence of this box. And I always like to say is, of course, he took a peek, right? He's in there all by himself. Of course, he took a peek at the Ten Commandments. But what happened is this temple got destroyed, not one stone standing on top of each other, and we lost track of that box. So for thousands of years afterward, nobody saw that box until this man discovered it in the 1940s. If you remember the story, he found it and was taken and placed in a government warehouse somewhere. Okay, so just having some fun there. But here's the point, folks. One person once a year was able to see this thing for thousands of years, and yet you know at least one Ten Commandment. So in the chat bar, put in one of the Ten Commandments. If you see one of yours is already up there, let's move on to another one. Let's see if we can get all 10 Commandments listed in the chat bar. And while you're doing that, because it takes a little bit of time to write some of them, I'm going to mention this. If Moses had if Moses had written out a bulleted list of 10 items on a PowerPoint slide, how likely are we to remember any of those? So just test your memory, put them in there, put them in the chat bar. Which, like I said, is thou shalt not kill is always the first one up, right? So what were some of the other ones? But when you're thinking of it, yeah, thou shalt not steal, right? We have, what else? Thou shalt not covet, which is always interesting because there was one about committing adultery, and then later you're not even supposed to covet the neighbor's wife, right? What are some other ones that you can think of? Yeah, covet thy neighbor's spouse, right? Exactly. So you had it in there twice. And so on. So thou shalt have no other gods before me. Honor your father and your mother. Have no graven images. No carvings was a big one. Seventh day to a day of rest. Not doing any work. Taking the name of the Lord thy God in vain, honor your father and your mother. Yeah, see, so we're getting all of these. I think just seeing, making sure we haven't forgotten one. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But the point is this, folks, we have this idea, this concept that was able to survive generation after generation after generation after generation, but passed down because of the story. That's what helps us remember it. A 10-point checklist we won't remember on a PowerPoint slide. But because it was wrapped around, now we can move this forward time after time after time. And that's the power of story. Our folks will actually be better able to remember and access information if it's delivered to them in a story. Okay, so again, when we're looking at this stage and we're looking at over here, now we can write things down, we can have PowerPoint slides and so on, but moving information along from here, let's say, when that story happened, all the way up to about here when it was finally put in. I mean, it had been written all the way through here, don't get me wrong, but you and I didn't have access to it till about here. So it was the story that preserved those 10 commandments over time. So again, just using that as an example of a story that most of us know, or information that most of us have at least some notion of, and we're able to maintain it and retain it because of the story. So again, story is very important. The first one is play, second one is story. And the final one here is, let me go back to this slide. Our conscious brain is developing during this time as well. So the hind parts of the brain, the small parts of the brain, we're there, we're always there, but we really didn't develop our consciousness and the language, all the words that we're hearing back and forth. So a lot happened in the development of us as a species while we were learning language, while language became more important to who we are. And so this is an area that I like to would spend more time on, certainly in the later webinar, because what I have found coming, again, I came to learning and development by kind of a weird route through the copywriting stage. There's certain things that we study when it comes to persuasive writing that and persuasive language, that it strikes me that if folks in the learning and development community knew these things, perhaps we would have an easier time communicating with folks, breaking down resistance, speaking in a manner that encourages them to engage, to stay engaged, and to learn. So I'm going to have a special webinar on this at the end of the month on language patterns. But just to give you a little what we say context for this is to talk about some different folks. So this is Anthony Robbins. So by all means, I love this. Just pause for a comment because I had the slide out of the way so I could see it. I mean, the chat out of the way so I could see my slides. Shannon said Moses was the first to download from the cloud to his tablet. Yeah, that's good. Shannon, I'm going to have to reach out and get your permission to use that in the future. That's a great line. Okay. All right. So back to Anthony Robbins. Helped millions of people, made millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars in the process, helping people change their lives. And what a lot of folks don't know is, thanks Shannon, a lot of folks don't know is that he got his start by helping people have instant change. So if they had a phobia, like let's say flying or something, that in just a quick session with him, they're no longer afraid of flying. And that's because he was using this guy, the work of this guy, Richard Bandler. And I always mention him with caution, but he is a very interesting person, odd, I guess is how you would say it. He came to psychology through physics and so on. It was involved in the early missile guidance systems and so on. And when he started looking at how the brain works, he realized that there's a lot of chatter that goes on in our heads. We're always interacting, talking, conversing, and that our way we think is determines who we are, what the decisions that we make. So you when you're looking at Richard's work, he was very famous for causing mental illness to go away in just a heartbeat, because he was always being challenged by the community. And so he very interesting guy. But anyway, he and a partner created what's called neuro-linguistic programming. Neuro, your brain; linguistic, your vocals, and then so programming. But ultimately, where he got his influence when it came to psychology was this guy over here, Milton Erickson. And Milton's story is fascinating. He was on a farm as a young kid. They had a ton of children in his family, at least 10, maybe more. And Milton got polio when he was a young man, so he couldn't be out in the fields working with his dad. They didn't have any way of helping him. And so they just stuck him in the nursery with his youngest brother, who was a toddler at the time. And so Milton was so paralyzed that all he could do is communicate with blinking his eyes. That he could hear conversations. So he'd spend his days listening to his sisters chatting in as they went about their day, and he retaught himself how to speak, how to write by watching his younger brother go through that process. So as a toddler, so as the toddler began to walk, Milton would copy him, mimic him, and so on. So out of this, he developed what we generally call conversational hypnosis. So before that, what we usually think of hypnosis being scary or this weird kind of thing that goes on in trances and all sorts of things like that. Milton noticed that we go in and out of trance, what we call state, all the time. So in this webinar, for instance, you've been doing that as you go into a state and then you come back, and there's certain times that I've triggered it so that you will come back and engage, and then other times I let you drift off, and sometimes I might communicate, especially if we were face to face, and I would communicate certain things and certain points when you would drifted away that would help you retain and so on. So there's a lot that we can learn from these folks, from especially Milton Erickson, that we could maybe apply to learning and development. So I believe I've promised 7 key phrases that we can use in our learning programs and for a little later on in that webinar. But I'm going to give you one of the most impactful ones, one that you can start using today when it comes to your programs. Now, when you hear this language pattern, you'll say, in just a little bit, you're going to say, really? That was it? Right? Because it's such a powerful, powerful word pattern, language pattern, that our tendency is to ignore it and to not use it, not apply it. And I want you to begin to apply it. I want you to use it and not to just let this one go, because this one is so powerful. See, understand this, folks. There is a certain script that is illegal for law enforcement officers to use. It's a very, very specific script that if they use it, you're essentially manipulating you. And it's all based on this one word pattern. Okay, are you ready? Here we go, the next slide here. The secret word pattern here is the brain has to answer a question. The brain has to answer a question. Look, okay. The brain has to answer a question. And isn't that true? Isn't that true? And isn't it true that you just answered that question in your head? Isn't it true this is the 3rd question in a row and you can't help yourself? do you think I can keep doing this? Do you wish I would stop? All right, the brain has to answer a question. Now, if you know this, could you use this in your learning programs? Now, it's one thing to understand, it's another thing to do this strategically, because now that you know this, you have to be careful of the questions you ask. So for instance, Anthony Robbins says we have to be careful of the questions we ask ourselves, because if you ask yourself, why can't I lose weight, or why am I always late? The problem is your subconscious brain is going to say, well, because you're lazy, because you're a glutton, because you're stupid. He says, instead of asking why questions of yourself, ask how questions of yourself. How can I lose weight? How can I get there on time? Okay, so this is a key one that you can begin using today. Okay, so feel free to use it in your own learning programs as we move forward. Again, ask questions, and then it comes down to what questions are you asking? What's the type of question? So that's kind of where the secret comes into play here. Okay, so that's one you can use. And again, I'm going to give you 6 more. We'll repeat this one and cover some more in the future webinar. All right, folks, so here you can see that one's going to be down here at the bottom somewhere on the 26th. I'll be going through that. Here's my email again if you want to reach out as after today. Okay, so folks, when we look at this whole thing, the point is this: what can we take from here that we can apply to our learning up here? And that's what I want to suggest here. And if these are three areas or three ways that we can do this, let's begin applying these to our programs immediately. Can you introduce play? Can you introduce story? Can you begin to ask questions to help in the learning process? And here's the reason for this, and you might have seen this. Gallup and Pew both did similar studies about the similar time a few years ago when they were looking at employees, and they said about 30% of our employees are actively engaged. Okay, so they're working hard and they're doing things. 70% are disengaged. 52% of those, roughly 52%, are just sitting there watching these three up here paddle the boat. They're sitting, they're just drifting. And then roughly 18% are actively disengaged, meaning they're pedaling backwards, they're poking holes in it, they're putting water into the boat. And here's the idea: if you could add just small bits of those things that I shared with you, could you convert 3 of these 7 into actively engaged? Okay, just by adding some play, adding some story, paying attention to your word patterns, could you move this bunch, 3, not all of them, just 3 up to here? And if you did that, folks, you've doubled the impact of your learning programs. So you're not going to convert everybody, but let's just go after 3. Okay, folks, getting close to the top of the hour. I do have an appointment I need to run to, so let me get my email up here. Questions, comments, if you would email me here at bighead@sententiagames.com, and that way you can move this. So if you just want to email me questions, comments at bighead@sententiagames.com, and then I'll be able to respond to you. All right. So, like I said, normally I'd have more time for questions, answers, and responses, but I was unaware that this other program had been put on my schedule. All right, folks. So, like I said, let's get out there. Let's make learning fun. Let's make it engaging. And if I can see you on a future webinar. Thanks a lot, folks.